Hi, this is Sarit Switzer, and welcome to the It Is Taught podcast, a podcast devoted to the teachings of Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi as recorded in his most famous work, the Tanya. My hope for this show is to make these teachings accessible and relatable to the average person, regardless of prior Jewish education or affiliation. The episodes follow the prescribed daily study portions and are meant to serve as practical lessons in how to live your life as your true self and develop an authentic and powerful relationship with your Creator. I have personally experienced the effects the study of this work has had on me, and I'm excited to share what I can of this knowledge with you. So please join me on this journey of learning, self-growth, and connection with your source. Hi, and welcome to the It Is Taught podcast. This is episode 386 for the 19th of Kislev in a regular year. So, Happy New Year, everybody, and good Yontiv. And for those of you who are newer to the podcast, you might be wondering, why are we at episode 386 if we are at the very beginning of the Tanya? So we begin, those of you who are familiar with this, we begin studying the Tanya anew every year on the 19th of Kislev, as that was the anniversary of the liberation of the author of the Sefer from Soviet imprisonment. We're going to talk about that a little bit more soon. But basically, another thing to know is that, as many of you know, the Tanya is divided up into portions, daily portions to read, so that we complete the entire Tanya in the course of a year. Now, the thing is, in Judaism, there's something called a leap year. So the Jewish calendar is both a lunar and a solar calendar, and it takes into account both the sun and the moon. And so because of that, in order to keep the holidays seasonal and in order to keep all of this in check, there is something called a leap year, which happens 7 times in the course of 19 years. And during leap years, instead of having the usual 12 years of the month, we add another month. We add a second Adar to the month so that we have 13 years of the month. So due to all of this, what ends up happening is that leap years have more days to them than regular years. So when it comes to studying something like the daily Tanya, for example, then the division of the daily Tanya into portions for the day so that we complete it throughout the year is actually different when it's a regular year versus it being a leap year. So by Hashgacha Pratis, by divine providence, last year, which was when I took upon myself to do this podcast and to start these daily episodes, it happened to be a leap year. So we went through the entirety of the Tanya, but according to the cycle of the leap year. So now we've approached a new year, we've approached a new cycle, and I guess Hashem wanted me to do this whole Tanya again and learn it anew. And study it together with you guys, so that this time I can give over these episodes in a way that accords with a regular year. So this will be a great opportunity for me to review the material together with you and maybe kind of go at it from a slightly different angle. Maybe this will be like a new and improved version, and hopefully I'll have gained a few more followers at this point. So very exciting. We're going to go on this endeavor together to start the Sefer Tanya of the Alter Rebbe once again today. So as I mentioned, the 19th of Kislev, this is the day that we begin studying the Tanya. So I wanted to give a little intro, first of all, about the 19th of Kislev and what actually happened there and what the Sefer Tanya is all about. So on the 19th of Kislev, in the year 1798, the Alter Rebbe was imprisoned. He was put into prison by the Russian authorities. Why? Well, the Alter Rebbe, who founded the movement called Chabad Hasidus, he had a lot of opponents. There were a lot of people who didn't like his method of teaching. Some coming from more kind of idealistic places, some less so, but there was a lot of opposition to the teachings of Hasidus in general and to the teachings and dissemination of Chabad Hasidus in particular. There was a lot of fear around Hasidus. A lot of people thought that this is not the correct way to serve God, that these more mystical ideas are the realm of very select scholars and should not be disseminated to the public, and that they can be very dangerous to the public. There was also a lot of misinformation surrounding the Alter Rebbe. Some of it was just accidental misinformation, some more malicious. So due to this, the Alter Rebbe gained a good amount of enemies, people who really tried to shut him down. And so one of these was a man named Avigdor. And Avigdor was part of what's known as the Misnagdish movement. The Misnagdish movement. Misnagdim means opposers. They were the opposers of the Hasidic movement. Interestingly, they actually gave that name to themselves. So it's not, people often think that this is like a derogatory term that Hasidim refer to people who are not Hasidim as being Misnagdim, but they actually gave that term to themselves. So anyway, so Avigdor was of this camp of the Misnagdim, and he informed on the Alter Rebbe to the Soviet authorities, and he lied to the Soviet authorities, and he told them that the Alter Rebbe was a traitor. What kind of proof did he have that the Alter Rebbe was a traitor? Well, so the Alter Rebbe at that time was collecting money for poor Jews who were in the land of Israel. This was a big, we'll see when we start learning the Tanya, that this is actually a very big theme that comes up in the Tanya, is this need to raise money for poor people, to give tzedakah, and in particular for people living in the land of Israel. So this was a very big passion of the Alter Rebbe. Now, the only thing is, at that time, the land of Israel was under the dominion of the Ottoman Empire. We're talking about the late 1700s. The imprisonment happened in the year 1798. And at that time, Russia was at war with the Ottoman Empire. So keeping all of this in mind, there was kind of like a reasonable case to be made that the Alter Rebbe was sending money, if you didn't know the context of it, that he was sending money to the enemies of Russia, and kind of trying to aid the Ottoman Empire in the war, even though this was not the case at all. In fact, as I mentioned, the Alter Rebbe was merely raising money for Jews in the land of Israel. But this is the misinformation. This is how kind of like rumors happen, right? So the Alter Rebbe got imprisoned, and he remained in prison for 53 days until he was eventually released. Interestingly, right after he recited a verse in the book of Tehillim where he said, Pada B'Shalom Nafshi, that may my soul be released in freedom. And then he was released. And this occurred on the 19th day of the month of Kislev. So this was obviously a very big day of rejoicing amongst the Hasidim for obvious reasons. Their Rebbe, their leader, was released from prison. And on a spiritual level too, as well, this was a great day that the Alter Rebbe rejoiced, because he recognized this as a sign that spiritually speaking, he was given the go-ahead to disseminate these teachings. This came about specifically because what happened was, actually, while he was imprisoned, he actually was paid a visit by the Baal Shem Tov and by the Maggid of Mezrich, both of who had officially passed away before then. However, it's understood amongst Hasidic teachings that he wasn't just visited by their spirits, but they actually came to him as souls and bodies, and they actually visited him in prison. And they explained to him that the reason why he was in prison is because there was a verdict in the heavenly realms against his teachings, and that it wasn't so clear cut whether he should be disseminating these teachings or not. And so the Alter Rebbe sort of took this very seriously, and he said, well, then if he is released from prison, does this mean that he should stop teaching? And they assured him, no, on the contrary. When he's to be released from prison, this is going to be a sign that the kitrug, that the verdict has been lifted, and that he should definitely disseminate the teachings with even more power and even more zest. So this is indeed what happened. And so as a result of this was kind of like the impetus for for the Alter Rebbe compiling together what it came to be known as the Tanya. The Tanya is actually made up of several books. The first of which is like the kind of like what the Alter Rebbe originally had in mind, like in terms of the Tanya, and it's made up of 53 chapters, which correspond to the 53 days that the Alter Rebbe was imprisoned for. This section of the Tanya goes by several different names, which we'll get into. One of which is Likutei Amarim, a compilation of sayings, Sefer Shir Beinonim, the book of the Beinoni, and also simply as the Tanya. This first portion of the Tanya deals with a person's kind of spiritual and emotional makeup and guidance in how the average person can and should serve God. We're going to get into a little bit more about what we mean by that soon. The second portion of the Tanya is what's known as Shar Echad B'Emunah. That's the gate of unity and faith, and that deals with more topics having to do with creation and God and all of that kind of stuff, like what is our world made up of and all of that. and what is the point of creation. And then there was another section which was added later on. Can be thought of as the third part of Tanya. This is what's known as Igeres HaTshuva, the pamphlet on Shuva, on how to repent, how to return to God, and it gives like very detailed guidelines on what Shuva is, how to do it, and all of that. And then there's the two final portions of the Tanya, portions 4 and 5, which were added later on posthumously after the Alter Rebbe passed away. And those are Igeres HaKodesh, which is a selection of a bunch of letters, many of which deal with tzedakah, with giving charity. A lot of also deal with learning Torah and, all kinds of different spiritual topics. And then the final portion, which is the Kuntrus Achron, which is this addendum kind of to the Tanya that has a lot of Kabbalistic kind of stuff in it. So for today's portion of the Tanya, today we're beginning this book. We're beginning the whole thing. We're beginning this cycle anew. It's a very interesting episode today because we actually aren't getting into the meat of the Sefer just yet. The cycle actually begins with the title page and with approbations that we're given. So we're getting very technical here. We're getting really into the nitty gritty of the book and what the book is made up of. So if you look at the title page, if you look at that opening page, if those of you that have a Tanya, you'll see like very right at the top, it says Sefer Likutei Amarim. And the first thing to notice about that, so that's how the Alter Rebbe wanted this Sefer to be known as Likutei Amarim. What does Likutei Amarim mean? It means a compilation of sayings. And the reason why the Alter Rebbe chose to term his Sefer as a compilation of sayings is he wanted to make it clear that these things that he's going to be teaching us in this book are not anything new. He's not making up these ideas. These ideas that he's going to bring out and he's going to teach in this book are ideas that are found throughout Torah and throughout the sages. He says, "Mi sfarim pisofrim," from books and from teachers, and he's just compiling them. He's just putting them together in a way that makes sense and that is like user friendly. Who are these sfarim and sofrim? These books and teachers. So the books, what's usually thought of as what the Alter Rebbe meant by the books, is the teachings of the Maharal, the Rambam, and the Shla, which is where a lot of Hasidic literature kind of and teachings gets its basis from. And when he says Soflim, when he says like his teachers, he's specifically referring to the Baal Shem Tov and the Magid, who are both his who he considered to be his teachers. He never actually met the Baal Shem Tov in person, but he still considered himself to be a follower and a disciple of the Baal Shem Tov, but really through more directly the Magid of Mezrich. Okay, so now, after saying that this is a Likutei Amarim, this is a compilation of sayings, and that this is the first part of this compilation of sayings, he says the name of this particular book, this part of the Likutei Amarim, is called Sefer Shel Beinonim, the book for the intermediate man. So what does that mean exactly, the book of the intermediate man? This is going to be a huge topic that the Alter Rebbe is going to delve into when we get into the meat of the Tanya, really defining what a Beinoni is, what is a Beinoni, and how does it contrast with some other definitions, like a tzaddik or a rasha, for example. Interestingly, kind of interesting factoid, the Alter Rebbe actually wrote another Sefer called Sefer Shel Tzadikim, a book of Tzadikim that was written for Tzadikim, for very righteous people, but that Sefer got burnt in a fire, so we don't have access to it. But what we do have access to is this book. This is the Sefer Shel Beinonim. And the Sefer Shel Beinonim, the book for the intermediate man, what this means kind of in colloquial language is this is for everybody. This is not for very... for Rebbeim, for tzaddikim, for people who are kind of out of our league. This is for the average Joe Schmo. And it's kind of going to, as we'll see, this is a sefer that teaches you what is possible, what you can do, what your potential can be. Because as we'll learn, a Beinoni is actually a very, very high level. It's a huge aspiration to get to, but it's something that we're all capable of. And this leads us into the next part of this title page, where the Alter Rebbe says that it's compiled from these books and from these teachers, as we mentioned, these very holy books and teachers, and it's based upon one particular pasuk in the Torah. What is this pasuk? This pasuk is Ki karov elecha davar meod beficha uvilvavcha lasoto. So this is a verse from Dvarim, chapter 30, verse 14, which translates to mean that this thing is very near to you, in your mouth, in your heart, to do. So what thing? It means to serve God, to access God, to connect with God. And specifically, as we'll learn, what it means is really to develop a strong sense of love and fear of God. And the specific wording of beficha bilvavcha lasoto, so it's with your mouth, with your heart, and to do. So it's really in thought, speech, and action is really where all of this comes together. So in your heart can be thought of as like your thought, speech in your mouth, and in action, to do. And the Alter Rebbe is really going to teach us how to do this. And this, if we want to kind of like just a quick definition of what a Beinoni is, that is what a Beinoni is. A Beinoni is somebody who is in full control of his capacities, of his thought, his speech, and his action. He may still have, and he still does actually have desires for all kinds of things that are not godly and that are materialistic and that are destructive maybe, but he is in control of them. He's a controlled human being who lives in a way that is with intention. It's an intentional kind of living. He's not reacting to the world around him, but he's actually living in a proactive manner. And so this explains the Alter Rebbe. This is what the point of the book is. This is his thesis statement for the book, what he's hoping that this Sefer is going to bring about. And then the next line is also very interesting, is he says he's going to explain how to do this because this is something that's very near to you, and he's going to explain how to do this in a long way and in a short way. B'derech aruka u'ktzara. With the help of God. So what does that mean? With a long way and a long way and in a short way. So there's various explanations for this, but two main ones are that there's this legend of the long short way and the short long way. And it's sort of like the story of a traveler who's going to visit a king, and he really wants to see the king, and this is like his whole aspiration is to see the king, and he's going on a path and he's trying to figure out how to get to the palace, and he encounters a person along the way, a local along the way, and he says, how do I get to the palace of the king? And the local says to him, do you want to go the long short way or the short long way? And he doesn't really know what that means, and he says, well, the short long way sounds short to me, so I'll try that. So he says, okay, sure. And so he leads him to a way that is very short, like the distance is very short. And he says, go that way. So he goes that way and he walks along the path, and it's a very short path. But then when he gets right to the place where he can actually see the palace, he sees that there's this huge blockage there. There's like a big gate. There are all these like ferns and trees and stuff like that, and it's actually totally blocked to him, and it's going to take like forever for him to get to. So then he works at it for a while, but he gets very frustrated, and he goes back, and then he asks the local again. He sees the local again, and he says, okay, that was can you tell me about the long short way? And he says, sure. And he points him in another direction, and the long short way ends up being this much more windy road that is like a lot more travails along the way, hills and mountains and swamps and all kinds of things like that. But eventually when he gets to the palace, there's a straight path to get right into there. So this is sort of to be understood as a parable for serving God, that there are lots of different teachings out there that can be very inspirational, that can kind of give us this like quick fix kind of thing. But that quick fix, that could be thought of as like the short long way. It gives you a quick fix in the moment. It makes you feel really good in the moment, and you get like so close to God, but actually it kind of fizzles out and you're not actually going to get there. Versus the way of Chabad Chassidus is actually what can be thought of as being the long short way. It's a much longer route. It requires a lot more effort. It's like there's not a lot of like quick fix ideas in this book. It's more like something you really have to study. As you see, those of you who've been with me in the podcast up until now, a lot of these ideas, it requires quite a bit of intellectual contemplation and sitzfleisch, as they call it, like really sitting and contemplating and thinking about it. But then when you get it, it sticks and you're there and you really do see concrete changes in your life and you are actually accessing God in a real way. Another way to think about this long short way type of thing is actually something which is going to be a huge theme of the Tanya, as we'll see, especially this first part of the Tanya. in terms of the love and fear of God, and how we're going to learn that there are two levels of love and fear of God. There's what we can think of as our innate love and fear of God, that which is we were all born with and it's very natural to us, and all we need to do is just access it, and it's right there, and we just need to uncover it. And then there's the more developed type of love and fear of God, which is more intellectually based. And this is something that requires a lot of study and time and toil to get to. And while the first type, the innate love and fear of God, there is something very special about it and very precious, it's thought actually to be on a lower level than the second one, which is the one that we really need to work towards. So once again, that first level of the innate love and fear of God can be thought of as the short, long way versus the more intellectual appreciation and development of the love and fear of God can be thought of as the long, short way. So that's kind of like just a brief overview of the title page here. And then the next thing that we find in today's portion is actually approbations on this sefer. And there are 3 approbations that come up in today's sefer. I'm not going to read them through you. This is something you can do on your own. You can look it up, chabad.org, lots of different places, whatever. But rather, I'm going to give you kind of like a brief overview of and some interesting ideas of what these approbations contain, who they were written by, and why they're here in the first place. So that's a good question. Why do we need approbations in the first place? I mean, we're talking about the Alter Rebbe here, right? Like, it's like, this is not somebody who we need, like anybody who was around at that time and who was a follower of Chabad Hasidus had intense respect and trust in the Alter Rebbe's teaching. So what were these approbations actually about? So the first 2 approbations, which we're going to look at, were actually written by colleagues of the Alter Rebbe who were fellow disciples of the Maggid of Mezrich. And they were very close. These 2 first approbations were written by Rabbi Zusha of Anapoli and Rabbi Yehuda Leba Cohen. And they were, the Alter Rebbe's colleagues. They were, I guess we can call them his peers, and they encouraged the Alter Rebbe to publish the Tanya, even though the Alter Rebbe wasn't so sure that this was a good idea. Why didn't he think it was a good idea? Because his teachings up until that point, they weren't compiled in a sefer. They were written out in different letter format and stuff like that. And there was a lot of people who either accidentally or intentionally would print these teachings, would print these pamphlets with a lot of errors in them. And this you could imagine, could be very destructive and very painful for the Alter Rebbe. And it's sort of, it sort of brought up the question, like, should these things be written down at all? Like, there was, for a long time, the teachings of Chassidus were really passed down in an oral fashion, and they weren't in a written fashion. But nevertheless, these 2 colleagues of the Alter Rebbe, they felt very strongly that this is all the more reason why, due to all this misinformation that was out there, and due to all these like copies of his teachings that contain so many errors and mistakes, there needs to be this one defined copy. There needs to be this one place that people can go to, that people can trust. And that's what they're giving their approbation for, is that this approbation is sort of like the assertion that this sefer that we're holding in our hands right now, this is the real stuff. This was written by the Alter Rebbe. It is correct, and any mistakes that are found in there, they will bring that up, are the mistakes of the publishers. It's not the mistakes of the Alter Rebbe himself. Now, as mentioned, so these two rabbis that gave this approbation were the Alter Rebbe's colleagues and were fellow disciples of the Maggid of Mezrich. The first one was Rabbi Zusha of Anapoli, and he's quite famous in his own right. You might have heard of him on your own. And interestingly, in doing some research for this podcast, I actually found out that he was quite a bit older than the Alter Rebbe, and he was actually even older than his teacher, the Maggid. He was 2 years older than the Maggid of Mezrich. He was 43 years older than the Alter Rebbe. And he actually wrote this approbation at the age of 94, and he passed away 4 years later. So he was a very old man who lived quite a long life. But Rabbi Zusha of Anapoli, he had a whole following in his own right, a very holy man, and he was the first person whose approbation appears in the Tanya. And the second one is Rabbi Yehuda Leba Cohen. Rabbi Yehuda Leba Cohen was also from Anapoli. There's less that's known about him. The main thing that seems to stick out about him is that he was the author of a sefer called the Or HaGanuz, which the Tzemach Tzedek gave an approbation to. So that sort of tells us that there was something special to him. If the Tzemach Tzedek, who didn't usually give approbations to Sfarim, if he was able to if he chose to give an approbation to this sefer of Rabbi Yehuda Leba Cohen, it tells us that there was something special about this man. So now in these approbations that we find, they're very similar. These two first approbations that we find, there's a lot of similarities. They were both written on the 17th of Elul in the year 1796, which was actually 2 years before the Alter Rebbe was released from prison. And the Hebrew corresponding year for that was the year Tav Kuf Nun Vav, or 5556. And we'll see why that's relevant soon. And so we'll see, like, within these approbations, there's a lot of like kind of little hints that are written in there, like cute little kind of hints at different things. So first of all, the fact that these approbations were both written on Tuesday, and Tuesday is thought to be a good day. It was the day on which, when God created the world, he said Ki Tov twice. So there's something about Tuesday that's thought to be a very auspicious day. It's a good day to start projects, to do anything medical related, buy a house or whatever it is. And the other thing is that these approbations were written during the week of the Parsha of Ki Tavo. The Parsha of Ki Tavo deals with the Jews entering into the land of Israel, and there were a lot of curses that were given to the Jews if they didn't follow God's will and things like that. So different people have looked at what is the significance of the fact that these approbations were written during this Parsha. So one is that since it was due to them, since this was like, this Parsha deals with the Jews entering into the land of Israel, Eretz Yisrael. Eretz Yisrael is associated with the idea of will. Why? Because the word Eretz, land, comes from the same root, the same shoresh in Hebrew as the word ratzon, which means will. So basically, something about like entering into the land of Israel, one way to think about that in a more spiritual way is that you want to do God's will, that you're striving to do God's will. And that's what going into the land of Israel implies. And the other significance of this idea of these approbations being written in the week of Ki Tavo is that, like, as I mentioned, Ki Tavo contains a lot of, God forbid, curses that could come upon the Jewish people. And so the Tanya can be thought of as like a remedy for these curses. And so the two approbations are very similar, though there are a couple of differences in them. One of the main differences is the way that they sign off, like in terms of what year it is. So in the approbation of Rabbi Zusha of Anapoli, he says that he's signing off in the year Pedutenu, which the year Pedutenu literally means the year of our redemption, of our release. But it also has the gematria of the year Tav Kuf Nun Vav, which was the year that this approbation was written. So it was sort of like a play on the words, that it's like sort of like this was the year of the, we're talking about how the Tanya releases, is a celebration of the release of the Alter Rebbe from imprisonment, and it's kind of like our release from exile. It's going to help us get out of exile through learning this book. And the way that Rabbi Yehuda Leba Cohen signed off is he said that it was the year Tav Kuf Nun Vav, which is, more explicit, like that was the year. But even that year of Tav Kuf Nun Vav, it contains within it the word taken, tiknu, to correct. So it's sort of like implying that this year it's like sort of like this sefer is going to serve as a rectification for different things. Another way to look at that is actually if you look at those letters, Tav Kuf Nun Vav, it's actually an acronym for Tanya, Ktoret, Neshama, Ve'ruach, that the Tanya is an incense for the Neshama and for the Ruach, for the soul and for the spirit. So another interesting way to think about it. In the approbation of Rabbi Zusha of Anapoli, he lists the publishers of this sefer, and the publishers were Rabbi Shalom Shachna, who's actually the son-in-law of the Alter Rebbe, later to become the father of the Tzemach Tzedek, the third Rebbe of Lubavitch. And this Rav Shalom Shachna is referred to as being Rav Shalom Shachna, the son of Rav Noach. And the other publisher that he worked with was Rabbi Mordechai, the son of Rav Shmuel Halevi. In both of these approbations, it's mentioned that the people giving the approbations are forbidding anybody from publishing this, republishing this sefer, this Tanya sefer, for the next up to the next 5 years, to prevent obviously any mistakes, or to at least minimize the amount of mistakes and printing errors that could occur. One more thing I forgot to mention, which I wanted to kind of just throw in there before I move on to the final approbation about this Rabbi Zusha of Anapoli, something that kind of shows the spiritual link between Rav Zusha of Anapoli and the Alter Rebbe, because they were very, very close, is actually, if you look at the dates of their yortzites, the dates when they passed away. So the Alter Rebbe passed away on the 24th of Teves, and Rabbi Zusha of Anapoli passed away on the 2nd of Shvat, which is 8 days later, which means that anybody who's born on the yortzeit of the Alter Rebbe is going to have, if it's a boy, obviously, then they're going to have their bris on the yortzeit of Rav Zusha of Anapoli. So there's that spiritual link there. So so now getting into that last approbation. So the final approbation was actually written quite a bit later. It was written in the year 1814. On the Hebrew date of the 22nd of Iyar, which was the Thursday in the year 5574. So this was written posthumously after the Alter Rebbe passed away already. The Alter Rebbe passed away in the year 1812, or in Hebrew, the year 5573. So these approbations were written 2 years after that. So what are these approbations about? So these approbations were written actually by the 3 sons of the Alter Rebbe, and they specifically had to do with including the final 2 portions of the Tanya into this being part of the Tanya, the Igeres HaKodesh and the Kuntras Aharon. So they felt that these 2 sections of the Tanya should be very much a part of the Tanya itself. And so I'll mention just what they are. So as I kind of mentioned it briefly, but I'll explain a little bit more now. So the Igeres HaKodesh is a compilation of different letters that the Alter Rebbe wrote. And so they were, the sons of the Alter Rebbe compiled them together into what we know of as Igeres HaKodesh. And they didn't compile them in chronological order, but they actually compiled them thematically so that there's different themes. A lot of it have to do with tzedakah, as I mentioned, Torah study, all kinds of different things that have to do with our service of God. And the sons of the Alter Rebbe really felt strongly that they should be included as part of the Tanya. The other part of the Tanya, the final part of the Tanya, is what's known as the Kuntras Aharon. Kuntras Aharon is this very, very esoteric section of the Tanya. It's the addendum to the Tanya, kind of. And we just finished learning it, those of you who have been with me in the podcast so far. And if you recall, it gets really deep, really mystical, really technical. And the idea of the Kuntras Aharon and why they felt that it was essential to be part of the Tanya is because it referenced the Tanya a lot. And what the idea of the Kuntras Aharon is, the Alter Rebbe examines many different portions of Kabbalistic literature, whether the Eitz Chaim, the Zohar, the Pri Eitz Chaim, different writings of various Kabbalists, and pointing out seeming contradictions or inconsistencies that are found there. And then the Alter Rebbe sets out to resolve these inconsistencies, often through referencing things he had brought out in the Tanya. So it sort of showed how the Tanya can actually be thought of as kind of like a commentary and kind of an elucidation and a clarification on a lot of Kabbalistic texts, in addition to being this kind of like, self-help, self-growth and development and spiritual book in helping our service of God in a more kind of practical way. So just to mention, these 3 sons of the Alter Rebbe were Rav Dov Ber, who he actually ended up becoming the Mitzvah Rebbe, the successor of the Alter Rebbe, the second Rebbe of Lubavitch, and then the other 2 sons were Chaim Avram and Moshe. So that's it. And tomorrow we're going to actually begin the Tanya, which actually starts with an introduction by the author himself, by the Alter Rebbe himself, but it is officially the start of the book. So that's what this book is all about. I'm really excited to learn it with you guys once again, as I mentioned. Every time these are the type of things, the teachings, there's a reason why we learn this sefer year after year after year. It's not enough to learn it one time. This is the type of thing that really you can learn it over a lifetime, and you're always going to be finding more depth, more meaning, more application to your life. So hopefully you can enjoy this with me and get just as passionate about this sefer as I am. And I look forward to being with you on this journey, and stay tuned, and we will commence tomorrow with the introduction. I will speak to you then. Thanks for listening to the It Is Taught podcast, hosted by Sarit Switzer. This podcast is dedicated in loving memory of my maternal grandfather, Avraham Yitzchak ben Binyamin HaKohen of blessed memory. Music by Shoshana. If you enjoyed this episode and would like to support the show, please share it with others and subscribe on YouTube, Apple iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. And make sure to leave us a 5-star review. To find out more about the It Is Taught project, including more information on my soon-to-be published book, please visit our website, itistaught.com. To catch the latest from me, follow me on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Looking forward to speaking with you tomorrow, and until then, have a great day.